One of the most interesting things that happened in the latest hearing of the court case in Paris between Philippe Carcenti and France 2 and Charles Al Durrah was a video presentation that France 2 made to the court. Now, you have to understand, this is a trial in which France 2 and their star Middle East correspondent, Charles Al Durrah, have taken Philippe Carcenti to court for defamation for having run an article in which he said that the story that they ran about Muhammad Al Durah had been staged by their cameramen and that they had violated all kinds of journalistic principles by running staged footage and presenting it as real. In the previous meeting of the trial on November 14th, the judge had ordered France 2 to bring and show before the court the raw footage that their cameraman Talal Abu Rahma had taken. These are tapes that very few people have seen, and by and large, this was the first public showing of them. There were lots of people who came to the court to see it, and throughout the showing, Charles Al Durrah and Philippe Carcenti argued about what we were seeing, Carcenti arguing that this scene or that scene was staged, and Charles Al Durrah insisting no. So here we have a case where France 2 is unnoticed and really under a microscope for presenting staged footage as real news, and then they make this presentation to the court in which they use staged footage as real news and accompanying it with a characteristic, what I would call Pallywood narrative that depends on Palestinian sources to describe the events and report the statistics of casualties, as here Bob Simon reports about the same day and the same place.
In this one tiny area, which Palestinians now call the Martyrs' Junction, more than 30 were killed and hundreds were wounded.
Now, we wouldn't even be able to discuss this if it weren't for the fact that France 2 and Charles Al Durrah decided to put this video presentation up at Charles Al Durrah's blog at the France 2 website. And so as a result, we can not only reconstruct Talal Abu Rahma's shot, his footage of this stage scene, but also we can look at how France 2, in fact, then edited it and used it in their presentation to the court. So let's start with the independent cameraman's take on this particular scene, which in the movie Pallywood we've called Molotov Cocktail Kid. The key figure in the sequence is the adolescent in the background with the black shirt, the blue jeans, and the bottle in his hand. He's running along the road away from the Israeli position. As he goes, note two things. One, he seems to have some red on his forehead, could be an injury. But B, ask yourself if he looks like he's injured as he runs. He hands off the bottle, and he runs into a crowd where all of a sudden, he becomes a casualty of war. Calling for the ambulance, the cameras come. Note he sits high, even though he has a head injury. And here's Talal Abu Rahma in to take the shot. Note also that they take him on the Israeli side of the ambulance. So this is supposedly somebody who's been hit by an Israeli bullet, and yet the crowd stands around with their backs to the Israelis, showing no sign of concern. Indeed, they're smiling. Now let's take a look at what we can reconstruct of Talal Abu Rahma's rushes of this incident. We've seen him photographing it from the other cameraman's point of view, and now we'll see what he photographed. And this we've done by putting together two scenes that appear in France 2's demonstration video. The young man in the black shirt and the blue jeans that we followed in the previous footage is in this sequence behind the no U-turn sign in the middle of the screen. Watch as he emerges. There he is. At this point, he's entering the crowd that's going to pick him up. There's the man in the red shirt. Now we have a casualty. This is the sequence that we saw Talal shooting in the previous footage, and we have additional ambulance evacuation scenes. Now, what's interesting about this is, first of all, the other cameraman is, I would say, a clearly superior cameraman, at least in this sequence. His footage is in focus. He gives us a sustained view of the scene, which in fact permits us to identify it as a fake. So in a sense, you could say he's a cameraman of Pallywood, whereas Talal is a Pallywood cameraman. Talal comes in, it's all cinéma vérité, it's out of focus, shaking thing, short scenes. You can't really tell anything from it except that there's action. And in fact, you have an ambulance evacuation scene which, if we didn't have the other footage, would be difficult to realize was in fact staged. Now, let's look at what France 2 has done with this footage. And mind you, they're aware of the other footage because they've used material from that footage in the rest of their presentation. Okay, so here is France 2's presentation of this tape.
Nous sommes le 30 septembre 2000, au carrefour de Netzarim, à proximité d'une implantation israélienne dans la bande de Gaza. 48 heures après la visite d'Ariel Sharon, alors chef de l'opposition sur l'esplanade des mosquées à Jérusalem, et 24 heures après un accrochage de la police israélienne avec des Palestiniens toujours sur l'esplanade des mosquées. Bilan de l'accrochage, 7 morts et plusieurs centaines de blessés. Ici, à Netzarim, des petits groupes de jeunes Palestiniens se rassemblent à proximité d'un poste militaire israélien. Des ambulances palestiniennes tournent, prêtes à intervenir. Du côté israélien, on riposte par des tirs de balles en métal caoutchouté.
What does this all tell us? What can we learn from this? In fact, it answers one of the questions that puzzled the judge in the case. She was ready to follow Philippe Carcenti when he showed in a couple of clearly documented cases that, in fact, France 2 had run as news staged footage. But she had trouble imagining how pervasive this might be. At one point, she turned to Carcenti and said, "So AP is also sold out?" Now, what we can see from here is that even under conditions where they're under great scrutiny, where they've been put on notice that people are watching for them using staged footage as real news, they go and use staged footage taken by their cameraman Talal Abu Rahmeh, present it to the court as real news, and accompany it with a narrative that depends on the same Palestinian sources that stage these scenes. So what it does tell us is that this goes deep. This is deeply embedded behavior. It's not going to change overnight. Even under scrutiny, it doesn't change. But it tells us something else, and this is the most troubling part. We can't know how pervasive Pallywood is. We've only begun to look for it. Now, as we begin to look, maybe we'll have a sense of what percentage of the footage that we see on TV as news is in fact not just Pallywood staged footage, but also Pallywood claims to casualty figures.
More than 30 were killed and hundreds were wounded.
And then that brings us to the larger and most serious problem with Pallywood. And that is, if the media are the eyes and ears of civil society, if they were what permit a free citizen to inform himself about the world and make decisions about leaders who will have an impact on events around the world, then they have to see with as clear eyes as possible. If our media are presenting us a radically distorted image of what's going on in the Middle East, we may make decisions that, rather than solve the problem, make it even worse. We have a right to demand that our news media pay attention to these problems, correct them whenever they can, and give us as accurate an image of what's going on in the Middle East as they possibly can. And in order to do that, they're going to have to be more awake than Charles al Durrah and France 2. This is Richard Landis from The Second Draft.